As the coronavirus pandemic took the world by storm, for the first time, many people in developed countries understood what it is like to lack access to essential medicine they need to survive. For people in poor countries, lack of access to medicines has always been a problem. This podcast explores the access to medicine issue and how we can promote global health more broadly. Famous scientist Marie Curie once said, "Talking is the best medicine." In this podcast, we will heed the advice of Curie and discuss how we can ethically and effectively tackle the health challenges currently affecting our world. Throughout this series, we will break down and explore fascinating new research being conducted by leading researchers and activists in the diverse field of public health who've dedicated their lives to understanding the problems and identifying the solutions to health crises that impact millions of people around the world. So sit back and enjoy this episode of Talk is the Best Medicine, brought to you by Global Health Impact Project in partnership with planksip.
In today's episode of Talk is the Best Medicine, I'm speaking with Nicole Hassoun. Nicole is a visiting scholar from Cornell University and a professor of philosophy at Binghamton University. Along with my program co-host, Ryan Woltz, a PhD researcher at UC Davis Internal Medicine, we discuss a recent paper published on Brookings.edu. The title of the paper is Pandemic Preparedness and Response: Beyond the World Health Organization's Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. We talk about what the COVID-19 Tools Accelerator is, how the authors of the paper suggest improving the World Health Organization's scope and efficacy of the tool by suggesting an improving replacement for the tool called Access to Pandemic Tools Accelerator. The difference is that this new approach or revision has a broader scope targeting pandemics in general and is not limited to COVID-19.
And the paper is with Larry Gostin, who is the director or the founding director of the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law at Georgetown, and Kaushik Basu, who's a colleague at Cornell in the economics department, and who is a former chief economist of the World Bank in India. So the ideas in the paper are not just mine, and the basic idea is that we see the world responding to the COVID pandemic by creating what's called the COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, basically, and Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator is kind of a collaboration of international organizations that came together to help do investments in therapeutics and vaccines and diagnostics and all the things you need to fight the pandemic. And so it's really exciting to see COVAX, for instance, which is just the vaccine arm of that, putting investments into developing vaccines, getting them out there to the world now. But at the same time, in rich countries, people have, like the United States, people have access to the vaccine. And in most poor countries that are supposed to be served by the COVAX initiative, it's just starting, right? The vaccination rates are really, really low. And of course, we sped up the delivery and development of this vaccine incredibly in the pandemic. But the question: could we have done better? Could we have been more prepared? Could there be things that we do better in the future? Is what we're trying to address in that paper. And so our proposal is just taking a step back and looking at that response, that we needed to do a lot more in order to be prepared for the pandemic by addressing what are called the structural inequalities that affect people's access to healthcare in the first place. So in the United States, but also around the world, we see minority populations suffering much more from the disease than other populations. And so that shows, the effect of this inequitable access to healthcare. And so one of the things we should do is prepare better for the future by, trying to make sure that people have access to basic primary care and that the population's healthy and and so forth, so that we'll do better. But the second big thing is, well, we need to help people address the economic as well as the health consequences of this pandemic. So, the World Bank is now stepping up with some financing, and other organizations are as well. But in rich countries, although I think our social safety nets certainly aren't sufficient, we're way better off than people in poor countries who, if they can't work that day, they can't eat, and when people lose their jobs, that can be really devastating. So how do we ensure that people have the economic support that they need to make it through the pandemic? And so that's one of the other kind of big things we suggest. But the heart of the proposal is to think about how we can do better on access to essential vaccines and other health technologies while speeding up the research and development process. So although it was really quick at the start of a major pandemic, in many cases, there's not a lot of research development being done on these pandemic threats, right? So antibiotic drug resistance is something you guys have heard about, and it's really important for treating things like drug-resistant tuberculosis and diseases that do pose pandemic threats. It used to be in the United States and Western Europe, I think 1 out of 4 people died from tuberculosis. If you get a drug-resistant form of that disease, it's not good, right? Like, you don't want that back. And so we need to do a better job of preparing and responding, speeding up research and development in general, and then extending access on the results more broadly. And so what the paper does is it brings together several different proposals in the literature for how to do that. And one of those is to provide prizes to pharmaceutical companies rather than patents. So that we're not thinking about getting rid of patents or replacing the patent system, but instead to create a new prize, a new alternative that companies could get. Hopefully it would be very attractive to them for developing things that they're not already doing largely and in preparation for those pandemic threats. But then requiring them to share knowledge, data, intellectual property rights if they buy into that. If they're like, we want the prize, okay, great, you get it. But when you produce the thing, then it's available for anybody to manufacture and sell, because 80% of our manufacturing capacity is in the generic side of things, right? And we don't need the big companies to have to try to buy up all that capacity. They can just produce it, and they can produce it in a competitive market at cost. And so then once we have those technologies developed and available, the second sort of part of the idea is pooled procurement. And what that means is that everybody should agree to purchase together those products through COVAX or something like COVAX, through an international organization. And then it's really important that organization be well-governed, be representative, and so forth, and fair. But the thought is, well, okay, they purchase up the supply that the world needs, and then they sell it or distribute it to countries according to need. So they differentially price the resulting product. So higher prices are fine in rich countries that can afford them. Maybe we don't need to pay $60 to vaccinate a person. Maybe we can pay like $30 instead, and that would be plenty. And we could get it at half price. But then the poorer countries would still only pay $3 or whatever per dose that they're hopefully supposed to be paying, and then we can take all that money, all the profits off of that, and use it to reward that investment, right? To set those prizes up for the next round, and also to invest in basic health systems and other things people need to get access to those medicines. So that's the core idea in the proposal, and there's some game theory and other things around it to make the case that this kind of is something we should take seriously. But I'll stop there. I'll let you guys.
Yeah, Nicole, there's certainly lots to unpack. One comment that I'd make, about that summary is that it kind of changes that corporate cycle, and I think it makes it more globally, fiscally responsible, with humanity in mind, and I think that's very commendable. I think if you don't mind, I'm going to start off at the beginning of the paper, and there's some language at the beginning of the paper that was initiated by the World Health Organization, and I'm outside of this type of circle predominantly, but I found that the terminology or the phrase solidarity call to action, I thought that was pretty interesting, and I'm just curious about how to measure buy-in on such a large initiative. There's multiple facets, as you've started to break down, but how do you get buy-in on such a complex initiative?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really good question. The World Health Organization, it's the World Health Assembly, that is supposed to decide whether there's going to be a pandemic preparation response treaty in November. So they're going to vote, the countries are going to come together and vote on whether to have a treaty. And then there's a question of what would be in that treaty and how can you get agreement to the treaty? How can you get, what kind of enforcement mechanisms could be put in that kind of treaty to get countries to collaborate better this time? Because what we saw, or next time, if we have another major pandemic, and in the interim, right, when we're not in that pandemic state, how do we sustain cooperation to get these drugs developed and create the funding streams and so forth? And so I have some thoughts about it. And, one of the things that you need is initial startup money, right? Like, how do you get the prizes for the pharma companies in the first place? One possibility is a tech tax, right? People are talking about tech taxes. We want to develop new technologies. Why not link the tech tax to the development of these new technology prize pools? Like, that seems like a great idea to me. Countries that are rich and able to, engage in vaccine nationalism really successfully at the start of a major pandemic, like the United States, they might not do better through this kind of thing, right? So there's a hard problem of like sustaining cooperation. In the paper, we suggest that it could be in everyone's best interest, because if we can speed up the development as well as like the manufacturing and the provision of these medicines by the kind of global cooperation we're talking about, and get it at a lower cost. Like in many cases, when there's not, especially a really intense pandemic like this starting, pooled procurement could save us money. It could be effective in getting us the technology at a lower rate. And so it seems very like a good deal. But sustaining the cooperation over time, especially if there is a major pandemic, I think is a good question. It depends on how you develop that treaty. And really, we need international lawyers to feed into that.
Simply put, you're suggesting that high-income countries would actually benefit more by providing healthcare to low-income countries than just about providing healthcare or medicine to themselves. And you give the compelling argument of resistant tuberculosis. So I guess. My question is sometimes I guess we can get into this kind of mixed scenario here where, only some high income countries buy in. And that may not be, you might have like staggering kind of benefits for each one. Is there a way to kind of prevent, or I guess maybe get everyone to buy in?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, I think it's arguable, the European Union could have done a lot better in global cooperation. It sort of depends on how you evaluate the risks and benefits of these things. So COVID is bad, right? There's no doubt. This has had devastating economic consequences as well as health consequences for millions of people. But I also think, it could be a lot worse, right? If we get a disease like Ebola or something that spreads, really far internationally, that's just, the death rate's 10 times potentially what we have. And so if we prevent something like that's a huge benefit. The problem is with a lot of public health interventions that you don't see the people who don't die, right? If you had a vaccine from childhood and you didn't get sick, then great, you're alive, but nobody knows that you would have gotten sick and would have died. So I think we often undercount the benefit of this kind of cooperation really extensively. There's social, there's economic benefits, and there's a lot of that's not seen. So I think it's quite possible that even the richest countries could benefit from it. And then designing and using international law to the best of our ability, I think is probably the best that we can do. So you can provide benefits for joining an agreement. You can provide incentives and enforcement mechanisms in agreement. So if countries create an international health treaty and, if people don't cooperate with that, those countries potentially pose a threat to other countries, right? They're not cooperating in protecting global public health. And so trade sanctions or restrictions on the movement of people seem from a moral perspective potentially reasonable. Question of the consistency of that with international law, pre-existing law and the Geneva Convention, for instance. But I think we should do our best to put in place good mechanisms to ensure the kind of cooperation that we can get. And then there's a question of what do we do when we don't, what do we do when we don't get it? And I guess there's ways of potentially making this idea more feasible, but it would probably come at the cost of the equity of it, right? So like, I think there's good human rights-based reasons as well as prudential reasons to vaccinate the world, right? If we, for prudential reasons, we should do it because otherwise we could get sick, right? And we could have another big economic crisis, brought on by a pandemic. On the other hand, maybe, there's the moral reasons. And so even when it's not, necessarily in our interest, if you save the other people's lives, that matters, and so we have reasons to help people for that. So, if we do trade-offs, like you could presumably, once the international organization procured the medicines, they could auction it off to the highest bidder, right? That would be very attractive to rich countries. They still get it. It'd be better than the status quo because you get that money going to COVAX. You could then invest in basic health systems and create rewards rather than going to pharma companies, which also do invest in things, but maybe not as equitably, because they're interested in just making the most money. And if they can do that by selling allergy medicine to people like me, that's the way they're going to do it. It's not necessarily based on the health consequences of those technologies. So yeah, I'm not sure I answered your question, but
well, I think that's a great response and a great answer. I think the issue of global buy-in versus a program that is flexible enough from a national standpoint, to meet the needs of nations is something that you seem to me to be like at the ground level of this initiative. Both academically, but it sounds like you've been able to really think some variables through on this program. And so the way I see it, your involvement in the program is essential because you've put so much equity into the initiative. So along with other people, like there's co-authors to this paper. And there's a big team behind you.
I'm really interested in just kind of putting the ideas out there. I think that there's people that who are actually thinking about this in a way that will matter. So there's an international panel for pandemic preparedness and response, and I wanted to make sure that people had the idea because it kind of really falls in line with what they're doing under, I think, 0.5 of their proposal that we could do such a thing. But it's very aspirational, and so part of the idea here is to say, like, what would the right solution be? Like, I'm a moral philosopher, right? Like, what would a good solution look like? So that you have leverage to say, like, hey, we're failing in a certain way. Like, we could do better and push it at least in that direction. So, through the media stuff that you do, and hopefully if people are listening, that public opinion really matters to what countries and companies can do, because international law provides that kind of critical leverage. It's at least something that you can use to say, hey, you're violating, international law. You're failing. So if they succeed in making a treaty, I think it can shift the public conversation, even if it's not 100% effective.
Yeah, so like an updated version of norms and social contract. That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so the paper, I want to move on to the concept of game theory, and the paper implements this as a part of it. It seems to be its working proof. It's a very compelling, mathematical framework in this kind of an all or nothing proposition. So nations have to cooperate. I think that's essential or the entire initiative, as it appears, the way I've read the paper, it runs the risk of failure. So the paper does go on to make the claim that it is all in all nations' interest, and I think that's part of part of the claim is to say, guys, it's really in your best interest here, to cooperate. Now, considering the world's inability to cooperate unilaterally on pretty much everything and anything, what makes you confident that this approach will be adopted?
Yeah, I don't know that it will be adopted. I think it can be adopted more or less well. Like, we could have, different lists of diseases that were, pandemic diseases that we, as a global community, if you will, decided that it was worth creating this kind of initiative for, or maybe it won't be adopted at all, and it serves that, like I said, that critical, it allows some people to push in the right direction even. I think, the game theory stuff's in there because Kaushik's really the game theorist, but let me kind of explain it just so we can talk about it a little bit if you want. And the idea is that if global cooperation kind of is in everyone's best interest, like take that for a second, it might still be the case that we're not there, right? So we're all doing this because we're not cooperating, right? Like if I don't buy it up, well, the United States is going to buy it up, or, you're Canada, and, the UK is thinking the same thing. And so we're all buying them up, even though we all realize that we would all do better if we cooperate. And so it's possible it's a prisoner's dilemma. It's possible that we're just failing to coordinate our actions sufficiently well. So to explain what a prisoner's dilemma is, it's kind of like with climate change, right? Like we all drive our cars, or at least most of us do. And despite the fact that it might end up making us all worse off than if we used public transit. And the reason for that is that, well, what's ideal for me is everyone else just takes public transit and I take my car, right? So there's always a reason to defect, even if the end consequence is climate change, and we all do worse than if everybody took public transit. So we may be in that kind of situation where, like, the best thing would be for everybody if we could get a really strong pandemic preparedness and response treaty in place or mechanism to help everyone get access to the essential medicines that we need and technology so we can combat a pandemic and shut it down really quickly. But individually, from the nation state perspective, you're like, well, yeah, I mean, that'd be great, but like, I'm gonna buy on the side, maybe because I don't have security, maybe just because, I'm being selfish or whatever. But I think the idea is that this kind of agreement provides a coordination mechanism, a way for us to say, like, okay, here's what we're going to do better. We're all going to cooperate next time. And so if it's kind of a situation where there's a prisoner's dilemma, we need some incentives, some penalties, like for non-cooperation, to make it in our individual interests to do what's, collectively best for everyone. If we're not in a prisoner's dilemma situation, it's not quite like climate change, but maybe like, it would all be better. It would be better for everyone if we all met up at a certain location. But as long as we meet up at some location, like, it's pretty good, and we're like doing this vaccine nationalism stuff right now, we want to get to like global cooperation, then just simply like saying, okay, like, let's all cooperate will be enough to sustain it. I doubt that's, the current situation for many countries, but either way, we kind of need a global agreement to get out of the situation we're in, and one that has teeth if we're in a prisoner's dilemma situation. And so that's why we're proposing, this kind of cooperation. Does that make sense? Sort of at a theoretical level?
Yeah, it does quite a bit. But I do kind of want to maybe ask you something a little bit different. That's a little bit more on your terms, since you said you're a moral philosopher. So let's talk about like which countries we want to actually distribute medicine to. So let's say that there's 2 low-income countries, and one of them is much more accepting of vaccines, and one of them, for whatever reason, whether it's religious or some other reasons, are a lot more skeptical of the vaccines or any sort of medicine. Which kind of country should be getting these medicines? Because obviously the one that is more resistant is probably going to be needing it more, with more people, having health problems. So I guess, like, how would you have that distribution between these 2 countries that both need it?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a good question. It's one that kind of goes beyond the current proposal, but it's something that I've, I guess, thought about a little bit. So Zeke Emanuel and colleagues put out a paper in Science that was advocating for a certain way of distributing the vaccines. And so I sort of engaged with that in another paper on how, we should think about helping people. And sometimes these decisions are really easy, right? Like, you wouldn't want to vaccinate, some person like me. Like, that wouldn't be optimal. I'm like able to be at home. I'm middle-aged. I'm not a particularly high risk. But then there's challenging cases, both at the country level and at, between individuals. Like, well, do you want to vaccinate the elderly, or do you want to vaccinate essential workers? And the essential workers, maybe they come into contact with more people, but they're younger, so they're less vulnerable. And so you're providing another kind of like hard hard case there. I guess I usually think about these things with what I call creative resolve. Like, we need to solve the fundamental problem in the country that's causing the vaccine hesitancy. Like, that seems optimal, right? We would want both countries to be able to fully vaccinate their populations. You obviously don't want to waste vaccines, so you wouldn't give it to countries beyond their capacity to absorb it, and I think on a first go, but you want to expand that capacity to absorb the vaccine by respectful, conversation, education, engagement, and maybe providing alternative forms of the vaccine. So if there's something that like is in the vaccine people aren't willing to take, can you make the vaccine of something that people are willing to take? And really to try
so you're kind of suggesting that
I don't know. Are you still there, Ryan?
Let me jump in with the idea of the creator resolve. I really think that's a really interesting term. I can equate it with responsibility, but I think I was really drawn to that. This idea of creator resolve. Right?
Talk about it a little bit if you want.
Sure. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, it's like a fundamental commitment to overcoming what appears to be a terrible dilemma or a tragic situation, right? So by questioning what's possible, and so philosophers love to play these games, right? Like, we got a trolley going down the track, and it's aiming for 5 people, but you can divert it onto a track to only kill 1 person, and should you press the button or not? And then we spend a lot of time telling our students, no, like, you have to choose. But I think it's actually the students who were right in saying, like, maybe we don't have to choose. Maybe there is another solution. Maybe if we scream really loudly, they'll hear us and get off the track, And in the real world, there often are those kinds of solutions. And so I think we need to be sensitive to the fact that whenever we set up a situation, an ethical dilemma, if you will, there might be a third option. There might be a better way. Now, sometimes there's not, and you have to make decisions. And that's going to be really important for saving the greatest number of lives, for instance, like if that's what you care about. And what I think really matters, one of the things I think really matters is having the greatest health impact. And there's a question then even about vaccine allocation, like, how should you measure that? Is it lives saved, life years saved? And there, again, you might say, like, well, if you care about lives saved, you're going to do one thing. If you care about life years, then you're going to do another, like vaccinate the elderly to save lives, vaccinate younger essential workers for life years. And in this case, it turned out that actually didn't make much difference. And it was really the elderly who were going to help you save the most. And I'm really happy to see that that kind of, in the US, we did prioritize the elderly because I think there were good arguments for that. But
yeah. Okay. You suggest that it's essential for a transparent, accountable government structure to address areas of structural inequalities. Okay. Economic restrictions, vaccine funding, diagnostics, treatment, and basic healthcare systems. Do you think that it's within the mandate of the World Health Organization to broaden their scope of recommendation? And do you anticipate any pushback, and what would that look like?
Yeah. So I think that the World Health Organization is only part of the global response mechanism. So the COVAX pillar of the ACT-A, which is that whole global response mechanism, is a collaboration between Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, SAPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and the World Health Organization. And so together, they have kind of set up one arm of this, but there's other arms, right? And one of those is basic health systems. Is a connector now, not an arm, but it's something that people realize you have to invest in order to get vaccines into arms. So it's one thing to make a vaccine, it's a totally different thing to vaccinate somebody. And the person has to be they have to go to the health clinic. So you have to get the roads, the vaccine has to make it to the health clinic. There's a lot of things that are involved in getting a person access to a vaccine to actually take it up. And so I think that it's already kind of in the mandate, but the structural inequalities bit, maybe not so much. So what I'm thinking about is in terms of preparation as well as response. Like what we want is a population that's not a whole lot like the United States population. I mean, one of the reasons we were so affected by the pandemic is that we have, people who are overweight, people in bad pre-existing condition, And so we get a lot more death and disability from that. And partly that's because I think we don't have universal health care. We don't have universal access to like preventative health care that would then, make it less likely to get such a bad effect from the pandemic. So that doesn't go to the inequalities portion, but it's part of the structural determinants of health and something that we need to address. The other inequalities bit is, having that be equitable, having it be fair, so that it's not, the income inequalities, the racial inequalities, the disability-based inequalities, all that stuff feeds into who actually has negative health consequences from the pandemic like this, which groups are most affected. And I think that we need to, focus on helping the least well off amongst us in order to make it more equitable and save the most lives and alleviate the most disability in general. So, yeah.
Okay, so I'd like you to explain to the listeners what exactly the global health impact is, your involvement, and how you envision global health impact playing a role in the rollout of this project in particular.
Yeah, so I am the executive director of the Global Health Impact Project, which launched with a conversation, I think, at the World Health Organization in 2015. We relaunched this index at Princeton in the end of 2019. And what we had done up to that point is really evaluate and compare medicine's health consequences around the world. And so having a way of measuring the health consequences of different medicines is, I think, essential to creating the right incentives for new innovation. And if you want pharmaceutical companies to address the greatest problems, for instance, you might want to tie the rewards they get to the size of the problems that they're addressing. Right now, we just give, the incentives are tied to who's going to pay the most for whatever it is you produce. And that, again, probably rich patients, often with chronic health conditions that companies aren't curing, but they're just addressing and can sell to people medicines for forever. And so the thought is, well, this opens the door, this kind of evaluation opens the door to incentivizing pharmaceutical companies and others to have a greater health impact. And so that was really how it started. And I recently published a book that talks about how you might create something like a fair trade label for health, for instance, based on this health impact evaluation. So companies that are having a great health impact could use that in their marketing and attract, consumers like me who might be willing to pay a little bit more for, like, I don't care what kind of Advil it is or ibuprofen, I'm willing to purchase the thing with the ethical label as long as I'm getting the product that I need. And if a small percentage of consumers are willing to purchase things preferentially from global health impact certified companies, it would create a pretty large incentive, for companies to do more to extend access on their medicines. And so that was one idea, one way of using it. And there's other ideas. I think I've become more interested in both the public health uses of it. So where are we succeeding and why is that? Why are we failing in a country that might be like relatively similar to another in addressing some disease like malaria when other factors are fairly equal? Like, if you can't even tell where we're succeeding or where we're failing, we can't answer those questions. We can't even ask those questions. And reasonably expect anyone to answer them. So, that's kind of the public health use. Or the other use of the index is to say, can we set targets? Can we evaluate performance? Can we better meet needs? And as the organization's grown, we've kind of moved more into the advocacy area. So this last year, we got a small WHO grant on vaccine allocation, which was able to support, it supports this podcast episode, for instance, and help us get the word out about, the equity issues that we're really keen on addressing. And the POVAX paper, the paper we're talking about, is part of that.
And while getting the word out is very important, I want to talk a little bit about contingency and extremes. We talked a little bit off air about this, and the answer makes a lot of sense. But let's say there's a global economic collapse because of a series of, say climate tipping points. For example, how would your recommendation solve the potential threat and change of the fundamental conditions, especially if this, for example, goes into legislative law and these kinds of things, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, this isn't a proposal to tackle climate change. So we also need to tackle climate change. But climate change is expected to, for instance, expand the range of certain disease-carrying mosquitoes and increase the chances and rates of pandemics. And insofar as we can effectively prevent and address some of those threats that seem like they're going to materialize, then we need to, I think, consider proposals like this. So it's not a panacea for all the world's ills by any means. It's really a method of increasing access to essential medicines and preventing potentially devastating infectious diseases. But I think, some of the kinds of creative ideas that we can put on the table like this can make a big difference. So, other work, I argue that we should have creative resolve for addressing things like climate change. Maybe, it's a change of people's values. It's a change in the way we think of our responsibilities, and things like prisoners' dilemmas that we need just as much as like technical solutions to climate change, better technology and whatever. Because if people still choose to take their car, right, and they think like what I'm doing doesn't make a difference, so I don't have an obligation to do anything else, even when we can make a difference together, then I think we're likely to fail. I think we need to fundamentally rethink what it is that's important to us, and think about, I guess, human development as something that is something that requires the security that we can provide for each other only if we work together and collaborate and use our creativity to better set targets, and meet everybody's needs.
Yeah. So I kind of want to ask kind of a little bit more about the POVAX here and what you're kind of suggesting. And one of the things that you're suggesting is to essentially have, let's just say vaccines being all funneled, like future vaccines funneled through POVAX and distributed to low-income countries, or, even high-income countries as well, where, in emergencies, we have to kind of purchase through here. Now, like, that's a really, really good idea for, normal times. But as we can see, especially with our healthcare, things don't really work in extreme circumstances that would work in normal circumstances. So in a future pandemic, when everyone's, freaking out about getting vaccines and trying to get vaccines and stuff like that, is there a way that you can kind of prevent POVAX from being biased towards like higher income country influences or something like that?
Yeah, so I guess I think it really comes down to the way that the international agreement or mechanism is designed, and that's where talking about governance really matters. So, one of the major complaints from civil society about the current ACTA architecture is that, it isn't very effective in bringing all the relevant voices to bear and making the decisions. Like people who are on the ACTA, groups, they'll find out about stuff. Maybe it's just telling them about it, but they don't have a way of feeding in as much as they need to in order to ensure that, we don't have things like happened in Malawi where, the vaccines aren't, I think it was in Malawi, but, there's some countries where, they got the technologies in a way that, it effectively that was too late. It showed up too late for them to use. They had to burn the expired vaccines, or it was going to potentially create vaccine hesitancy. And so, there's other cases where countries have gotten technologies that are, they don't have the reagents or whatever to do the diagnosis. So they have the new technology, but not the whole, everything that they need. And so better integration of, countries and civil society and other organizations throughout that architecture and design of the organization, I think is pretty important. The World Health Organization, for instance, could lead in a way, and they have very good country level representatives. But even, thinking about it just, as a philosopher from outside, I think it's really important that if we're negotiating a treaty, if countries are going to negotiate a treaty, that they do so for the global public good, for the common good, and not really in a way to represent the interests of their constituents. So the constituents come to the table, yes, but then it has to be for the whole world. And when we're making an international agreement, otherwise, I think what we get is some kind of balancing of interests and donors and this kind of thing. And so really, in this case, on the facilitation council, I think they call it, pharma and Gates have very big voice, and that's probably essential in some way, but also, it's not going to be as effective as if you're getting, the knowledge that you need on the ground to make sure that the vaccines are, actually able to get in arms and people can get diagnosed.
My next question actually has to do with POVAX being permanent, and I think you've partially answered it in terms of how we can legalize it, and this would be through treaty and through government legislation. Probably in a world forum, and then also at a national level. But what do you think in terms of enforcement? Is this really in the realm of like embargoes, or countries that don't play fair, don't get access to natural resources in a global trade system? Like, is that kind of where your mind drifts? I know it's very speculative, but I'm
so I'm not an international lawyer who could create the actual agreements, but I do know, how the World Trade Organization has an arbitration panel, and there are trade penalties and so forth that seem to be somewhat effective, though of course it's always tilted still on the interests of the rich countries that can actually, use the enforcement mechanisms without retaliation and so on. Or I guess in other, respects. So I think, this is supposed to be kind of a critical, project where, for me at this stage, where it's sort of, what would be ideal? What would be good? What would really work if people would get behind it? Because what we can achieve together is up to us. If the world can't achieve it, it can't achieve it, that's it. But, there's no one who decides that but us. And so you can implement some of this, right? So there are prize funds for drugs and new developments. There's been pooling of intellectual property through, for instance, the Medicines for Malaria venture, I think, or the Medicines Patent Pool, which has, generated some new drugs and treatments and things for HIV and hepatitis C, I think, and quite a health impact there. So it doesn't have to be that it's for every drug and every disease. The idea is more can we look at the list of priority pandemic conditions? A question mark for me is, well, what about existing ongoing pandemics that aren't being adequately addressed, right? So AIDS, it would be great to have an AIDS vaccine, right, for the world. There's a huge AIDS pandemic still. People don't realize it because, many people in rich countries have access to really good treatments. But I think that, you could potentially include that on the list of target diseases. And then the idea is that CEPI or another organization, maybe the World Health Organization, creates what's called a product profile. And so they did this for the vaccines. They say, these are the conditions under which, we will be willing to give you advanced market commitments, like they did, right? And that could be the prize mechanism. You could do it through advanced market commitments. We'll purchase up however much manufacturing capacity you currently have. Beyond that, I think it should probably be in dollars rather than in purchase agreements, because otherwise it just creates inefficiency in markets. And then these, requirements are in play that, we're going to give it to you, but we're going to give it to you with certain conditions. And I don't see why we should be, funding the development of these with public funds and then the companies get to keep all the profit. I don't think that's reasonable. And I don't think they need to have this kind of $60 per person or $40 per person vaccinated Moderna and Pfizer for the world. I mean, come on. It's a little bit outrageous. And so I think we can take some of that back. We can, whether we will, and whether, right now Gates is not thinking forward, I think, on pandemics. They're generally in favor of the intellectual property system and so forth that we have in place. And, it's not that it didn't work, right? We did get the drugs developed. We didn't get them accessible, right? And so what they may push for something like CEPI, right? Something where CEPI they just pay for a pharma to get the first and second phase clinical trials done and then hand them over with some access conditions. I don't know. And I think, that's not optimal. It's optimal for pharma. Sure, pharma will like that. But from a public health perspective, it's not optimal. And so this is a far cry from let's eliminate intellectual property, right? This is a voluntary scheme where companies would have a financial incentive to sign on. And yes, you need to get the funding there in the first place. But the hope is that with those profits coming back to the organization, it'll be self-sustaining into the future and allow us to invest in basic health systems and so forth. So I think there's strong moral reasons to do it. And when we don't do it, we failed, right? When we don't do something better, we failed, and that needs to come out clearly and is a lever for pushing in the right direction, even if we never get there. So that's my passion coming out. So.
Yeah. So, we're kind of we'd like to move on to some student questions, but there's something through our conversations I think is really important for the audience to kind of understand. Is you always argue that access to a minimal quality of life is kind of a human right.
Let me see if I can take that one over. Living minimally good, dignified lives. Can you comment anything about that and anticipating government policy and how we can, foster those outcomes?
Yeah. So I'm writing a book on the minimally good life. And the idea is, one that was in my last book as well on global health impact. And the thought is that people have, I think, a human right to health that should protect their ability to live a minimally good life. I think we have other human rights that should protect that ability to live well enough. And so I have an idea about what we need to live well enough. And I think it clearly includes access to essential medicines on reasonable conditions that people can afford. And so, to some degree, you can use this moral justification for, I think, largely the existing international legal system of human rights to support the proposal. Of course, moral arguments only go so far, right? That's where the ideology comes in. That's where you're giving an argument for something that people might not be moved by. Like libertarians are going to be like, human rights? Like, what is that? I have rights to property and whatever I want to do with it. And that's pretty much, in my body, and that's it. And so saying that other people have rights to things, I think, you can give arguments that are going to appeal to people who might disagree with you. So for the libertarian, my first book, I argued that, people should at least be able to object, if not consent, to coercive laws. And in order to do that, they need to be able to reason and plan. And that requires food and water, and a bunch of other stuff. And so in order for us to even object to coercive laws and for those laws to be legitimate, we need to put in some social safety nets and things for people, because if no one else is doing it, then the governments are going to be illegitimate because, they're not going to have provided their subjects with what they need to be free under the rule. And so that's one argument I've given that's supposed to address skeptics. On the minimally good life side, it's more like trying to paint a compelling picture. So I think, there's some pull to this intuitively that we should put ourselves in other people's shoes when we're thinking about whether their lives are good enough. And so if we do that and we say, well, if I were that person with their history, their psychology, their circumstances, am I now content to live that life, or is there some serious problem there? And then I want to argue that that's, we owe people that as a basic minimum to respect what I'll call our common humanity. And that's partly the relationships we stand into other people who are free and, I think equal people, human beings. So I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, Nicole, I as a philosopher myself, I do applaud that even if the work that you're doing doesn't manifest into something in this particular lifetime, we know from the transmission of books and the work that posthumously frameworks and literature and thoughts and ideas can be eventually implemented. So, all hope is not lost. Let's keep the next section to just under about 5 minutes. So we're going to run through 4 questions from students and just quick response. We've got to try and wrap this up by the top of the hour. So first question is, will low-cost generic production affect the quality and effectiveness of the medicines or vaccines?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it depends. So I think there's generally requirements for retesting vaccines before generic approval. I think it would be important to set it up so that the initial testing and the quality standards and how to manufacture it and so forth were available to people. So hopefully no, it would be the product that was developed and tested that people would then be manufacturing. And I guess you could worry about oversight of the manufacturing process and quality control, but we have mechanisms for that. So I'm not sure I see a problem there, but it is a really good question.
Okay. Now, the next question was, how long would it take to implement POVAX and to see signs of success?
That's a really good question, too. I mean, so suppose they say, yes, there's going to be an international treaty. And I think that then is a question of how long it would take to develop the treaty. And that would be how long it would take to implement the proposal if it were picked up in such a treaty. And then the question after that is how long to see effects. And I think, new drug development takes time, and we're looking at incentivizing that. We know how quickly it can happen for new vaccines now. I think it depends on the complexity of the product that's being developed. Might take much longer for some products, especially without as much financial and reputational and other incentives to do it. But you could see results within a few years for sure, I think. And then the question is, what that's new product development. Is that the result you have in mind, or is it people getting access to the medicine? And I think you might see broader access to the results than you would see with typical product development, which would generate a 20-year patent and make it highly inaccessible for most people if the product's priced highly by the company to maximize profit.
Yeah, so the framework can be implemented very quickly, but then the life cycle of various different aspects could take quite a while to see the the cycle repeat itself. So, okay. Will a company's status as a private or public company affect the strategy used to persuade them, the reward for their efforts? ? Can you imagine incentives for non-profit researchers or academics to do drug discovery to find new and more effective / safer drugs?
Yes, absolutely. I think, Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative also kind of will help develop new drugs for neglected diseases, and they work with all kinds of organizations. And so it's, some NGO develops something, that's fine. It can be private, it can be public, it can be academic. I think it should be open to anyone who can produce the drug, because the reward is for just producing it. You don't have to be able to manufacture it. And then anyone can manufacture it. So it should be easy for people to register products that meet the product profile conditions.
Okay. One final question from the students. Do you think it would be an effective idea to improve or update the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 12, that specifies, big question here, right? That specifies that individuals have a human right to health. Shouldn't there be a standard set that prevents inequities from being allowed and prevents rich countries from monopolizing medicine and healthcare?
Interesting. I love it. I love the idea. Google Health Impact Interns. Thank you, Ariana. I think I dropped to that one. So let's see. I guess, there's the possibility, I suppose, of changing or updating or adding to existing international laws, as well as creating new treaties. And so that wasn't the mechanism I had thought of here. I think, oftentimes what happens is there's general comments on the, Declaration of Human Rights, and those help clarify the implications of the rights. And so the general comment on the human right to health specifies, obligations of different agency organizations, and there's some, international guidelines on the roles and rights and responsibilities of pharmaceutical companies. And so, yes, I think we should continue to explain and expand upon what the human right to health means in a way that would hopefully get companies to live up to their moral obligations. And in the book that I just published, I argue that pharmaceutical companies are actually failing in their moral obligations and in some cases violating rights and by their lobbying efforts and so forth. At least the justified moral human rights that I think should be institutionalized in international law, whether or not they actually are, as I think they are.
Well, we want to thank you for coming on, Nicole. And I just want to ask you one last thing. If there's kind of an overall message that you could leave for the audience here, if there's kind of one or two sentences or a conclusion that you can leave for people to either think about or kind of ponder throughout their day, what type of message or question would you want the audience to know?
It's a good question, Ryan. I guess I think it's really important for us to all work together to think creatively about good solutions to difficult problems like access to essential medicines and pandemic preparedness and response, and to realize that what we do is up to us. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to the GHI. And we have some other people to thank, I'm sure. But I think we're going to be ending here pretty quickly. Is there any last thoughts that you have, Daniel?
No, I'm great. We got a little closing, but again, thanks everybody. And, until next episode, thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. To find more of our content or explore the exciting work being done by our parent organization, the Global Health Impact Project, you can check out our website at global-health-impact.org/new in the description below. The Global Health Impact Project hopes to continue to support efforts like this podcast to provide information about and advocate for access to essential medicines. Also follow the Global Health Impact Project's social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Until next time, don't forget, talking is the best medicine.